The 9th generation Honda Civic retains the bold, styling theme of its predecessor, but beefs up quality, improves efficiency, and pays particular attention to ride and refinement, so dramatically improving its appeal in the Focus Class family hatchback segment. As a result, an already strong and very practical package is now a whole lot better. Its rivals should worry. The Honda Civic, a family hatchback that in 8th generation form, sold between 2006 and 2011, was frustratingly close to greatness. After all, it offered the smartest styling, the greatest practicality, the slickest gearbox and the sportiest engines in its class. If only the ride, refinement, running costs and cabin quality had been better. If only the lifeless steering hadn't disguised the responsive handling. If only the awkward rear hatchback arrangement hadn't put off so many on the test drive around the block. You can't afford if-onlys the way this segment is at present, and the Honda engineers were sent away to do better, knowing that in essence they had a class-leading design to work with. The result? This 9th generation Civic, launched early in 2012, offers no excuses. It's the car it should have been 6 years earlier. And it's a model that Honda reckons every thinking buyer in this sector really ought to consider. Cars of this kind were always closest to the heart of company founder Soichiro Honda. Back in the 60s, when the best the motor industry could offer a small family was something like a lumbering Morris Oxford, it was he who pioneered the idea of a space and fuel efficient small family car with a high-tech flat-4 air-cooled 1300cc engine. It was thinking that led to the launch of the original Civic in 1972. A model series that over the next 40 years would go on to sell over 20 million cars around the world, over 650,000 of them in the UK. For this Mark 9 version, a radically different look wasn't needed. All Honda had to do was to make it nicer to ride in, higher tech and cheaper to run. Sounds easy, doesn't it? But it's taken over 5 years for some of Honda's finest minds to get the recipe right and produce this car. Let's put it to the test. So, get in and get comfortable. What's it like? As driver-focused as ever is the answer. There isn't another car in this class I feel as comfortable in as quickly. The perfectly positioned seat and pedals, the way that the gear lever falls beautifully to hand, the way that the futuristic dash delivers everything you need to know in perfect line of sight. Okay, so the start button is rather unnecessary, but it does kind of fit in with the whole high-tech feel. And punching it in this 1.8 litre iVTEC petrol model releases a raughty engine note that cashes the check promised by those sporty looks. In short, you don't need a sporty Type R model to feel fast in this family hatch. On the move in this car, you're first struck by the near perfect weighting and smoothness of the brake and clutch pedals and the lovely snickety precision of the 6-speed gearbox. There's an automatic option on the 1.8 if you really don't like it. But whatever your transmission choice, what'll quickly become clear is that this Honda is a very easy car to drive. If there is a problem, it's that it's not quite such an easy thing to see out of the back of. Now, to be fair, both rear 3/4 vision and your view rearwards through the split rear tailgate are both better than before, and you do at least now get a rear wiper on that tailgate. But it's still not ideal. It's something you quickly adjust to, though. A bit like the characteristics of the 1.8 litre iVTEC petrol engine that I'm testing here. Now, this 142 PS power plant is the one that most customers choose, claiming the performance of a 2 litre engine with the economy of a 1.6. And that's pretty much how it pans out in practice. This car managing rest to 60 in 9.1 seconds on the way to a top speed of 134 miles an hour. That's over 4 seconds and 18 miles an hour faster than the entry-level petrol 1.4. But it's a high revving unit. That's what the iVTEC bit is all about, which means that you have to storm up to 6,500 RPM to get the full 174 Newton meters of torque on offer. Fun up to a point, but a bit irritating if you don't like all the noise that goes with it. Now, mindful of this, Honda's engineers have bent over backwards to improve things in this respect, adding new seals, extra noise insulation, and even bonding in insulation into the windscreen glass. Now, the result is an improvement, but at cruising speeds, other rivals are still more refined. That's the case with petrol Civics. The 150 PS 2.2 litre iDTEC diesel does much better in this respect, which is slightly ironic given that with competitors, refinement is one reason not to consider the diesel option. Here it's the other way round, as perhaps you might expect, given that this diesel variant has almost twice as much pulling power as the 1.8 litre petrol alternative, so you don't have to rev it as hard. Perhaps an even better solution is the 120 PS 1.6 litre diesel, also developed for this car, but that variant can't get close to the 2.2 litre DTEC's levels of performance. The top Civic diesel manages rest to 60 in 8.5 seconds on the way to a top speed of 135 miles an hour, and that's enough to match the best of this model's direct rivals. Okay, so it goes well. But what's it like around the corners? If you owned the previous generation of this car and were familiar with the spec of this one, then you might be excused for having a few worries on that score. After all, under the skin, the high-tech looks of this Civic mask an intentionally low-tech suspension design. There's the kind of torsion beam setup that family hatchbacks of this sort used to have 10 years ago, at a time when even the Mark VII Civic model had switched to a suppler multi-link suspension arrangement. The reasons why have everything to do with practicality. Yes, a good multi-link setup like you get on a Ford Focus or a Volkswagen Golf works brilliantly on a twisty country road, but you pay for it with restricted boot space. So what if the old torsion beam arrangement could be made to work almost as well, preserving the Civic's class-leading cabin space? That's what the Japanese engineers have set out to achieve here, and after extensive testing on bumpy British roads, very nearly succeeded in providing. Clever fluid-filled suspension mountings borrowed from the luxury Legend model means that this car now floats over bumps its predecessor would have crashed across, and there's extra feel for the electric power steering. Not quite enough perhaps to suit enthusiastic drivers, but definitely an improvement on what went before. The result is that this is now one of the very best cars in the class to drive. Now, if you're tempted to write this 9th generation Civic offers little more than a facelifted version of the previous car, then don't be. For a start, the previous car was one of the best looking family hatchbacks yet made. Changing a winning formula would have been stupid. Instead, the Honda design team wisely settled for careful evolution, creating a shape 20mm lower and 10mm wider that offers a squatter, more purposeful stance. All I would say is that this latest design is a lot more colour sensitive these days. It's a lot easier, for example, to appreciate the neat Y-shaped design of the front grille and headlights with lighter hues than with darker colours like that I have here. Perhaps the most important decision the designers had to make was whether to keep the previous version's split rear screen, much criticised by owners of the old Mark VIII Civic. I'm glad it's still here. It gives the car a really distinctive rear impact that'll be easier to live with now that this narrower central bar has been dropped to create greater rearward visibility that now allows space at last for a rear wiper. Now, this feature is also integral to the class-leading aerodynamics, an area where huge efforts have been expended, the Civic design team borrowing gifted aerodynamicists from the company's discontinued Formula One programme. Now, the result is a lot more than just a slippery shape. There's everything from shark fin style mouldings on the tail lights to underbody panels that direct airflow around the car. On the diesel variants, there are even little micro spoilers mounted here under the tail lights. The result is certainly a sleek, sporty look, which is just as well, since this time round the Civic doesn't offer buyers a three-door body shape. Must backseat passengers pay for this? To some extent, yes. The rear side windows are larger than before, incorporating hidden door handles within their frames, but they are still smaller than is usual for this class of car. Compensation when you take a seat inside is provided by Plentiful Leg Room and a near flat floor, which frees up space for a central rear passenger. Headroom may be a tad restricted if you're really tall, but most will be fine. Now, these seats can't slide backwards and forwards, but that's because they can do something far more clever. If you've got something tall to carry, say a plant from the garden centre, children's toys or a load to take to the tip, you can flip the seat bases up, cinema seat style, and get your load in far more easily. Now, other rivals can't offer this kind of versatility because they have complicated multi-link suspension systems, taking up space you'd probably rather see devoted to passenger room or baggage capacity. In contrast, thanks to its simpler torsion beam setup and the designer's clever placement of the fuel tank underneath the front floor, this Civic can offer an enormous 477 litres of luggage room back here. Now, okay, so that's 15 litres less than you got in the previous generation model, but it is a huge 127 litres more than you get in a Volkswagen Golf, and an enormous 161 litres more than you get in a Ford Focus. Now, 76 litres of the total capacity is taken up by this useful underfloor compartment. Now, as usual, if you need more space, you can push forward the 60/40 split folding rear seats that fold with a simple dive down motion to create a completely flat floor. There's a 1,210 litre total loading capacity that's 1,600 millimetres long and 1,350 millimetres wide. Now, I tell you that so that you'll know there's enough space in here for, well, up to 3 mountain bikes with their front wheels removed, or 3 large golf bags, or even 3 extra large Samsonite cases. So, the practicalities are taken care of. Even in terms of interior storage, you can after all fit 2 1-litre bottles plus a couple more 350 millilitre bottles or cans in this area between the front seats. But what about cabin quality? This was, after all, frankly, an area that let the old Mark 8 Civic down. It wasn't that the British factory in Swindon didn't screw the cars together properly. It always has. It was that the choice of trim materials was poor, featuring scratchy, cheap-feeling plastics more suited to a cheap city car. Now, things had to improve in this 9th generation version if buyers were to consider it in the same breath as something like a Volkswagen Golf. And sure enough, there have been great improvements. Honda is especially proud of the so-called hide-and-seek finish that you'll find on top of the dash. It's a material, it's a soft grain plastic that from some angles looks like leather, from other angles has a more technological linear type finish. But that isn't what'll grab your attention when taking a seat behind the wheel. There isn't a cockpit I can think of this side of a motor show concept car that looks more willfully futuristic, with its dual plane architecture, a mixture of analog and digital instrumentation. In principle, it sounds like a bit of a mess. In practice, it all works brilliantly. To your left, on the centre console, just above the perfectly positioned gear stick, is what Honda rather pretentiously calls the information interface zone, where you get just above the air conditioning controls this 5-inch Panasonic colour screen with information displays on the aircon settings, the audio system and the sat-nav. You can even personalise its homepage by uploading your own picture. Directly ahead of you are three deeply recessed sporty dials with metallic surround trims, and above them is the driver interface zone, an upper display that arcs over the main instrument binnacle and is viewed above the steering wheel rim, gathering together key information like speed at the natural point of eye focus, and including to the left a further TFT colour information screen. Now, complementing all of this is a perfectly set up driving position with reach and rake adjustment for the beautifully tactile leather trimmed steering wheel and height adjustment for the very supportive driver's seat. By the same token, the signature Civic drilled metal pedals are also worth a mention. First, for being over the top, and second, for being in exactly the right place. Civic pricing sits in the expected bracket for Focus size family hatchbacks, so you're looking at paying somewhere between £17,000 and around £27,000 for one. Now, at the bottom end of the range, it's probably worth finding an extra £1,500 to go from the entry-level 1.4 litre petrol to the much pokier 1.8 litre VTEC petrol that I have here. As for diesel power, well, you can see why Honda felt the need to develop a 1.6 litre unit. Aside from that, there's a premium of well over £2,000 to go from this petrol 1.8 to a 2.2 iD-Tech developing a similar amount of power, taking potential buyers of that 2.2 D-Tech to a price of well over £20,000, and that's something that for many of them will be a bit of a stretch. So, how does Civic pricing compare to that of obvious rivals? Well, there are so many, it's difficult to know where to start. For the sake of simplicity, let's limit the comparison to the three cars that dominate the family hatchback segment: Ford's Focus, Vauxhall's Astra and the Volkswagen Golf. And let's start with the entry-level Civic, the 1.4 VTEC petrol. Now, for up to a couple of £1,000 less than this car, you could get yourself into an entry-level Ford Focus, the 105 PS 1.6 litre petrol version. But you'd have to sacrifice on equipment to do that. An equivalent Astra, the 1.4 16-valve 100 PS petrol version, would cost about the same as a basic Civic, while an equivalent Volkswagen Golf, the 1.2 TSI 105 PS version, well, that would cost you about £1,000 more. My suggestion, though, to potential Civic buyers would be to talk to their Honda dealer about trading up to this 1.8 litre petrol model. Not only because it's much better to drive, but also because it compares much better price-wise to obvious rivals. After all, for comparable performance at the £18,000 price point, you've to find, £1,000 more for a rival Vauxhall Astra 1.6 16-valve turbo, or up to £2,000 more for a Ford Focus 1.6T EcoBoost 150 PS. And at least both of those can match this Honda's performance. Volkswagen will charge you £1,000 more than a 1.8 litre Civic for a 1.4 litre TSI 122 PS Golf that struggles to match this car's performance. But what about diesel power? Well, finding well over £20,000 to own a 2.2 iD-Tech Civic might seem quite expensive, but you have to bear in mind that that is £500 less than a far slower Vauxhall Astra 1.7 CD TI 130 PS, and it's £1,000 less than a rival Volkswagen Golf 2 litre TDI 140 PS. It's also not much more than you'd pay for a rival Ford Focus, the 2 litre TDCi 140 PS version. Now, whichever Civic model you choose, the 1.4 litre iVTEC petrol or this 1.8 litre iVTEC petrol variant, or indeed one of the iD-Tech diesels, you should find your car to be decently equipped, because all Civics come with alloy wheels, LED daytime running lights, a climate-controlled auto air conditioning system. You get the iMID driver information display. There's electric windows all round, power-operated mirrors, an alarm, and a hill holder clutch to stop you drifting backwards on uphill junctions. You also get a stereo system that's clever enough to retune itself via a neat shark fin type aerial as you go through areas of different frequencies. And it also offers you USB compatibility and is compatible with your iPod. And glory be, you even get a rear wiper. Now, I wouldn't normally bother to mention this feature, but unbelievably, the previous Civic hatch didn't have one. The designers talking about droplet dispersing aerodynamics and forgetting how useless that is in slow-moving traffic. Other features fitted to plush models are available as options further up the range, include sat-nav, a rear parking camera, Bluetooth connectivity, smart locking, leather trim, a huge panoramic glass roof, and bi-xenon HID headlights that are able to dip themselves for you at night. Now, as you'd expect from a car in this day and age, twin front, side and curtain airbags are standard right across the range, as is Honda's VSA stability control setup and the usual electronic aids for braking and traction. You also get active front head restraints to minimise accident whiplash and the usual Isofix child seat fastenings, plus a front end designed to minimise pedestrian impact. Now, to get more than that, you need to opt for a plusher model or take an expensive trip through the options list. This car is fitted with the desirable CMBS collision mitigation braking system that warns you if you're about to collide with the car in front. If you don't respond, the car will automatically tighten the seat belts and help you brake to minimise the accident impact. Now, this feature is available on plusher Civic models packaged up with Honda's ACC adaptive cruise control that helps you maintain a safe distance to the car in front. For the first time, Honda has a diesel offering in this class that's good enough to match and probably beat the best that the opposition can throw at it when it comes to running costs. Now, Honda has developed a 120 PS 1.6 litre diesel to take on the best of the sub 100 grams per kilometre of CO2 opposition. But even the 150 PS 2.2 litre iD-Tech returns a very impressive set of running cost figures, despite a 10 PS improvement over the same engine in the previous generation version of this car. So in that variant, you'll get 67.3 miles to the gallon on the combined cycle and put out just 110 grams per kilometre of CO2. Now, at the time of this car's launch, that was miles better than the kinds of figures produced by directly comparable powerful diesel rivals. Cars like the Ford Focus 2-litre TDCi 140 PS, the Volkswagen Golf 2-litre TDI 140 PS, and the Vauxhall Astra 1.7 CDTI 130 PS. All of those kinds of cars would take you 10 fewer miles on every gallon and put out around 20 grams per kilometre of CO2 more. And of course, that has not only an impact on running costs, but also on benefit in kind taxation. As for petrol power, well, the entry-level 1.4 iD-Tech variant manages 52.3 miles to the gallon on the combined cycle and puts out 129 grams per kilometre of CO2, while this 1.8 litre iD-Tech version manages 48.7 miles to the gallon on the combined cycle and puts out 137 grams per kilometre of CO2. Now, these figures are assisted by the standard fitment of a stop and start system. Honda calls it idle stop, which cuts the engine when you don't need it, when you're waiting at traffic lights or at the crossing or stuck in urban traffic. You also get a gear shift indicator and, less predictably, a vent in the lower front grille of diesel models that opens or shuts as appropriate to improve the airflow that's 12% more slippery than it was in the previous generation version of this model. Going further than that, to improve running costs really requires driver cooperation. It's about the way that you drive. And to enlist that cooperation, Honda has included two further standard eco features borrowed from its planet-friendly hybrid models. First, there's Eco Assist, which advises users on how their driving style can improve economy by changing the colour of the speedometer lighting. So at idle or during sudden speeding up or slowing down, it's blue. If you drive more economically, it goes green. And in between, there's a sort of blue-green lighting during gradual acceleration or deceleration. Honda's other contribution to enviro-conscious motoring is something you have to select. It's called the Econ system. You push this green Econ button to the right of the dash, and it activates a gentler throttle map and tweaks the air conditioning system, and the result is much greater efficiency. But wouldn't you want that all the time, perhaps with a power button for press-on driving? It all amounts to the same thing, I suppose, and at least the way that Honda has configured it, you feel green-fingered in the way that you drive. Peace of mind continues to remain a compelling reason for Civic purchase. I like the little touches, like the misfuel prevention device on diesel models that stops you putting petrol in. You also get a decent 3-year, 90,000 mile warranty you'll almost certainly never need. This car has, after all, long been at or near the top of countless JD Power customer satisfaction surveys. And that is certainly not going to change with this better quality, improved 9th generation model. Now that in turn leads to impressive residual resale values, according at least to independent experts like Eurotax Glasses, who reckon that a 150 PS 2.2 litre iD-Tech diesel model will retain a healthy 42% of its value after a typical 3-year, 60,000 mile ownership period. Insurance will be affordable too, 3 to 4 groups lower than the previous generation model, groupings for mainstream models ranging between 8 and 20 on the 1 to 50 grouping scale. Kaizen, the Japanese approach to continuous improvement, characterises every aspect of this 9th generation Civic. It may look similar to its predecessor, but it's a couple of generations ahead when it comes to dynamics and engineering. And it shows that Honda isn't afraid to go against the grain when designing a car of this kind. After all, you couldn't imagine any other mainstream maker bringing you a car of this kind with high revving but potentially noisy VTEC petrol engines, a space efficient but potentially ride compromised torsion beam suspension design, or a stylish but potentially awkward to use split rear tailgate. But Honda has. In the Mark 8 Civic model, none of this stuff really worked. The difference with this Mark 9 version is that the designers have sorted things so that it does, so that owners can live with the benefits of their brave and characterful approach. The sporty feel of the engines, the brilliant magic seat practicality of the cabin, and the distinctive concept car looks of rear styling that'll have the neighbours craning their heads over the fence. Add to that class-leading running costs, brilliant British build quality, and the best gearbox and driving position you'll find, and you've a tempting package perfectly suited to those willing to look beyond the Focuses, Astras and Golfs that most will choose in the family hatchback sector. Dynamic functionality was Honda's goal in creating this car. They've achieved it.